Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 30b, The Last of the Romans, Mind's Monumental Worth O'er Marble, When End Endures Beyond Unmet Ends, on the resounding legacy of indomitable intellect. After writing episode 34, I realized that some of the key points I'm making there might not be sufficiently clear without going back in historical time to lay the foundations of it. Plus, in the previous released episode, 33b, we have discussed the revival of only one strand of the intellectual literature and legacy from what's called the European classical antiquity. Let's briefly go back to that past to complete that picture first. Also, as you can tell from the hints in the title, this is in some sense an extension of episode 30 that came out 6 weeks ago. I ended that episode by the potentially provocative suggestion that perhaps Rome fell when the Republic fell. Let me now add some more color to my case behind that proposition. We know that Rome emerged as the supreme military power in the Mediterranean in the Iron Age, initially in the Western Mediterranean, starting with Latium, and then Italy itself, but then going on to dominate Iberia, that is, Spain, Portugal, important parts of North Africa, such as Carthage, Tunisia, and thereabouts today, and by Caesar's time, Gaul, France, and thereabouts. This was facilitated by the fact that there was, with the exception of Carthage, no real state-level competition for the growing republic in these lands. There were sporadic raids, skirmishes, and threats from the north. The Gauls even are said to have once crossed the Alps to sack Rome around 387 BC, but these were usually repelled soon enough. Carthage was somewhat different, once, with its Phoenician heritage, even more powerful than Rome, and as we know, under Hannibal, came close to destroying Rome. However, in the East, things were somewhat different. In line with our coverage in episode 23 and episode 24 and episode 30, to mention a few, we know that large and powerful states had come and gone over more than 2,000 years. Alexander's rapid rise had spread Hellenistic dominion as far as Bactria in modern-day Afghanistan and to the very doors of the Indian subcontinent, and after his sudden death, his generals had carved it up for themselves with three main powers centered around Egypt, the Near East or West Asia, and the Greek lands in Europe itself. For over a century, there was some sort of a balance of power between these three main powers engaged in internecine warfare among themselves. But suddenly, around the year 200 BC, the Romans got dragged into the east and ended up conquering the Greek lands.
See footnote here for a discussion of the dynamics.
Given this background, what's relevant to our story is what comes next. New man, fresh hopes, high dreams. Now fast forward 100 years to around 100 BC. The political turmoil I hinted at in episode 30, with the Republican institutions unable to adapt to the rapid expansion, is in full swing. It is into this Roman world that enters one Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero was an outsider. Rome emerged with a small set of ancient families, the patricians, as the military and political elite. Although power had slightly more been extended by this time to a few plebeian families, it was still very much an in-group. Cicero came from outside the city of Rome, about 3 days' travel back in the day. He was of Volscian and not proper Roman descent. This meant that he had considerable barriers of entry into Roman public life. He was, like a very rare few by his time, a novus homo, a new man, and the military nature of Roman political ascendancy also meant Cicero, with health and other issues, and therefore unable to grow in the ranks of the army, had yet another handicap. But Cicero, even while seeing himself as a dual national, and despite these two setbacks, was ambitious about making a mark in Rome. What all this meant was that, unlike his peers and rivals in Rome, he had to make his way into Roman public life and up the Roman political ladder, cursus honorum.
See footnote.
Purely by merit and grit, which he had in buckets. And given these barriers, the best way for him to do this was by taking the intellectual route. And the best way to do that in Rome was to master the art of speaking, as we'd say, or in classical times, the art and science of rhetoric. Roman public and political life was very much lived out in the open, in the forum, which is where, beyond other affairs, took place the great political speeches and the great legal cases. Yes, especially the legal cases, because unlike our own experience of courtrooms being these secluded indoor affairs, legal disputes were handled out in the open, which is where the jury convened and litigants and defendants had to make their case out in the open, come rain or sunshine, no, literally. Furthermore, it also meant huge throngs of crowds could turn up just for the drama, but with no tickets needed, and our man trained to be an advocate for starters. On course for honors. With this as a base, and with some smart, strategic and tactical maneuvering, and even audacious moves, he slowly but surely made his way to the top of the Roman greasy pole. At age 43, getting elected to the post of consul, the top office of the state in the Roman Republic, with what today we'd call a landslide vote. Those who studied this part of Roman history would know how he handled the Catilinarian conspiracy intended to bring down the Republic with a plan of assassinating many senators and the consul Cicero himself. With exceptional skill and courage, and perhaps some pragmatic decision-making, not to mention using his extraordinary oratory skills in perhaps the most iconic piece of oration of his career, he decisively thwarted the plot. This earned him the rare and prestigious honor of Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, a rare honor bestowed upon only two other figures in the Roman Republic, one more than 300 years ago, and the other, the mythical Romulus himself, which suggests Cicero was the only real historical figure to receive this honor in the Republic. On a knife edge. We discussed in episode 30 ideas such as Romanitas and Virtus, civic virtue. Cicero emerges as the stoutest defender of all such Roman values, including the Republic itself. But this was, you might say, ultimately in vain, for, as history knows very well, and as we touched upon this as well, the Republic fell. The final phase of this was set in motion when his contemporary, Gaius Julius Caesar, was assassinated. What's perhaps noteworthy here is that despite his staunch defense of the Republic, which clearly Caesar was a threat to, Cicero was not involved in the literal backstabbing of Caesar. It's extremely painful when the greatest project of your life, one that you gave your heart and soul to, is at the brink of collapse. What do? By the time Caesar met his death on the Ides of March, 44 BC, Cicero, now 62, was an elderly statesman and with much less influence in Roman affairs than in the good old days. But this was his last chance. A following 18 months saw the most extraordinary outburst of literary output, if not in those times, for a long time to come. The uncertainty Caesar's death had entailed gave Cicero hope that the Republic could be restored. Of course, it can be said his efforts came to naught. He was brutally murdered by Mark Antony, and his beloved Republic was by then beyond restoration, as we saw last time. But even in this, Cicero's shrewd ambition and determination shines through, and one might say, despite these deaths, he ultimately came out on top. Let's see how. When conquered minds, conquered minds. Let's first look at the problem facing him and his contemporaries in his younger days. The Greek question. To my mind, the Roman conquest of Greece is one of the most fascinating events in cultural and intellectual history. Here they were, the Romans, with their military might and certain institutions, as we covered in episode 30, aiding their ability to mobilize and make war quite effectively. And with this, they had conquered the Greek lands. But Greece, despite now fallen militarily, was an altogether different beast. The Romans, one might easily say, had almost next to nothing compared to the towering intellectual achievements of the Greeks. We saw in episode 23, and we know of this amply in posterity, that the bulk of the great achievements were wrought on the fertile intellectual soil of the ancient Greek city-states. Yes, the Romans had developed a comprehensive legal system and a well-oiled military machine. But what else? This question sparked an intense debate in Roman society. The magnitude of Greek achievement could not be ignored. But at the same time, Roman pride, especially buttressed by their ever-growing military might and territorial expansion, could not come to accept Greek intellectual supremacy over their own. This is where, like I said, I'm fascinated that the Romans, with their superior military machine, simply did not destroy Greek civilization. They were themselves captivated by the people they'd conquered. How many other such instances do we know of in history? There is, for example, this story that after the conquest, well-to-do Romans made a beeline to buy up the more experienced of the now enslaved Greeks to bring them home as tutors for the kids. Elevating erudition! But the dilemma prevailed, and there were voices across the spectrum, between full rejection of Greek elements to wholesale embrace of them. It was Cicero who in a sense resolved the question for good. He formulated a synthesis where, with his knowledge of Greek and training in Athens and Rhodes, during a 2-year holiday of sorts, with several great Greek scholars under whom he honed and perfected his skills in rhetoric, philosophy, and related disciplines, he not only translated some of the great works and ideas from the Greek into the Latin, but gave them a unique Roman character and promoted them as new and improved Roman works, even claiming them to be superior to the Greek originals. As part of this was Cicero's enhancing of the expressive capabilities of the Latin language, including the adoption of several Greek rhetorical elements, and his developing of what may be seen as a unique, or at least extraordinary style of diction, in the use of devices incorporating a cascading set of clauses, subclauses, and further extensions, in effect resulting in an elaborate, exquisite, and intricate, but nevertheless carefully thought out and cleverly crafted sentence structure, which became the hallmark of what later came to be called the Ciceronian style, that has been emulated, not only in Latin, but in other tongues, including our own, justifiably or superfluously, elegantly or awkwardly, successfully or counterproductively, by every student, statesman, and seeker of eloquent, elevated, and erudite rhetorical expression beyond his near contemporaries. Through the Middle Ages, into modern times, to this day, to this hour, to this minute. If you think this is contrived, just look up the writings, if not of John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell, those of Thomas Jefferson, or the speeches of other early American presidents. Old man, new words. And then there is that 18-month marathon we touched upon in the final years of his life. It was in this period that Cicero completed 12 major philosophical works. Let's not forget, the word philosophy back then had a somewhat different meaning and purpose compared to now. It encompassed all intellectual inquiry. The sheer list of his works, going beyond translations of Greek originals, ideas or texts, is staggering. And as part of this, he took upon himself another monumental task. For Latin, given the culture in and conditions to which it had hitherto been put to use, was not capable of conveying a great many of the thoughts and ideas already expounded in Greek over centuries by now. Cicero himself coined a great many new Latin words. A great many we still use in their English forms today, some of these in Latin having a deeper meaning than in modern use. Qualitas, quantitas, evidentia, essentia, probabilitas, perceptio, humanitas, moralis. That last one from a Greek word we also recognize, ethikos. Furthermore, it was to Cicero to standardize the transliteration of words from the Greek alphabet into Latin, including conventions for sounds that didn't exist in Latin, the orthography, which English has in particular preserved fairly well. To this we owe the PH in philosophy, PS in psychology, CH in chronology, TH in ethics. The damned best! As we saw in the previous part, beyond the Roman Republic, eventually even the Roman Empire disintegrated in the Latin West, and the Roman Catholic Church entered the ensuing power vacuum to take grip, which it, with some power sharing with the temporal rulers, held for the next 1,000 years at the least, holding, crucially, a monopoly over writing, education, and literature. The Church was, of course, founded on a very different ideological, or if like, theological basis. Thoughts, works, and deeds of the pre-Christians and other non-believers were of little value, is any at all. But despite that, medieval scholastics in the Church could not help be driven to the power of Cicero's works. It is reported that it was the reading of a work of Cicero's that catalyzed the eventual conversion to Christianity of a young man hitherto said to have led a hedonistic lifestyle, St. Augustine. And then there is the story of St. Jerome's dream, where he is brought before judgment and accused of being a follower of Cicero and not of Christ. Many such scholastics of the medieval church had great admiration for Cicero that he made it through to that small number of non-Christians tolerated by the church under the device of righteous pagan, and some of whose works were, therefore, deemed to be acceptable to preserved and passed down by the monks. And this is how a good deal of the heritage of Latin that survived, with Cicero being the most sought after of the Latin authors amongst the more intellectually minded of the scholastics. So let's see what we're left with. Marcus Tullius Cicero, an outsider, made it to the top of the Roman power pyramid, going right on to be called Father of the Fatherland. And despite being a civilian rather than a military bigwig as was the invariable path to political ascendancy, Cicero gave everything to and eventually lost his life while trying to preserve his beloved republic. Cicero, to the point of competing with Christ, came to dominate the attentions and admirations of some of the leading church fathers. Augustus, heir to Gaius Julius Caesar, boasted toward the end of his reign, as quoted previously, that he'd left Rome a city in marble. But where are the marbles of Rome today when compared to the intellectual legacy of Cicero? Perhaps, and in what perhaps is the greatest irony of Rome, we should leave the last word to Julius, that triumphant expander of Roman frontiers, who once said Cicero had won greater laurels than those worn by a general in his triumph, for it meant more to have extended the frontiers of Roman genius than of its empire. Wasn't Caesar right